What happens when a living legend, a man who spent 6 decades creating music that defined generations, who's sold over 250 million records worldwide, who's been knighted by the Queen for his contributions to music and charity, who's maintained dignity through every possible storm, walks onto a talk show expecting professional discourse, only to encounter a host who sees scandal as more interesting than achievement. When someone who survived false accusations that nearly destroyed him meets someone who believes that bringing up resolved trauma constitutes brave journalism. When a conversation about music and memoir becomes an interrogation about allegations that were thoroughly investigated and completely dismissed, but which some people refuse to let die, because keeping someone wounded is more entertaining than celebrating their survival. What you're about to witness is not just another uncomfortable celebrity interview, not just another moment where a host crossed boundaries, not just another instance of talk show tension. This is the moment Sir Cliff Richard, Britain's longest surviving pop star, a man who's faced down the British tabloid press at their absolute worst, who endured 2 years of hell that would have broken lesser people, finally said enough to someone who thought that being cleared of all wrongdoing somehow wasn't enough. That innocence proved through exhaustive investigation somehow left questions worth asking, that a man's pain was content worth mining for television ratings. The View had secured this booking after months of pursuit, desperate for the kind of legendary guest whose mere presence would generate interest across demographics. Sir Cliff, at 73, was experiencing something of a renaissance. His memoir, The Dreamer, was climbing bestseller lists. His upcoming tour was selling out venues across Europe, and his story of faith, sustaining him through impossible circumstances, was resonating with audiences who'd watched his ordeal play out in real time. His publicist had negotiated the appearance carefully, as they always did with Cliff's media since the nightmare began. Focus on the book. Celebrate his incredible career, discuss his upcoming tour and his charitable work. No ambush questions about the investigation that had dominated his life for 2 years before he was completely exonerated. Standard protocol for someone who'd been through what Cliff had endured, being falsely accused, having his home raided on live television, watching his reputation get destroyed by media more interested in scandal than truth. The producers had agreed enthusiastically, assuring everyone that they understood this was a celebration interview, not an interrogation. They knew Cliff's story. They knew he'd been completely cleared. They knew that rehashing the trauma served no journalistic purpose, and would only cause pain to someone who'd already suffered more than anyone should have to endure. But Joy Behar had spent the morning in production meetings, making it clear that she wasn't interested in what she dismissively called a puff piece about some aging British singer. He was investigated for a reason, she'd said to her fellow hosts, as if being investigated itself proved guilt, rather than the investigation's conclusion being what actually mattered. People deserve to know the real story, not just his sanitized version where he's the perfect victim. What Joy called the real story, Cliff would soon recognize as the same cruel narrative that people who'd never been falsely accused love to deploy against those who have that being cleared doesn't actually mean innocence, that smoke must indicate fire, that defending yourself proves you're hiding something, that surviving false accusations with your faith intact somehow makes you suspicious rather than admirable. What Joy fundamentally failed to understand, what people who've never had their lives destroyed by lies could never fully grasp, was that Cliff Richard hadn't endured 2 years of hell and emerged intact by being willing to smile and nod while someone reopened wounds that had barely healed. He'd survived by being tougher than anyone expected, by maintaining faith when everything seemed darkest, and by knowing absolutely that truth eventually wins even when lies get all the attention. This isn't about whether public figures should expect scrutiny, whether celebrities must answer all questions, whether being famous means surrendering your right to boundaries about resolved trauma. This is about the difference between legitimate journalism and cruelty disguised as accountability, between honest questions and calculated attacks, between holding powerful people responsible and refusing to accept that an investigation's conclusions matter more than your predetermined narrative. Joy Behar thought she was doing brave journalism, asking the questions that other hosts were too intimidated to ask. Speaking for all the people who supposedly didn't believe Cliff's innocence, despite 2 years of exhaustive investigation finding literally nothing. What she was actually doing was demonstrating why false accusations destroy lives even after exoneration, because there will always be people more committed to suspicion than to facts, more interested in maintaining someone's guilt than accepting their innocence. And when Sir Cliff Richard, who'd maintained grace through the darkest period of his life, who'd emerged from hell with his faith and dignity intact, who'd spent 60 years proving his character through actions rather than words, finally reached his limit with Joy's particular brand of prosecutorial questioning. What unfolded wasn't just explosive television. It was a masterclass in recognizing when someone is trying to destroy you, refusing to participate in your own destruction, and walking away from rooms where truth doesn't matter because the narrative has already been decided. Buckle up, because what you're about to witness isn't just a heated clash. It's a moment when someone who'd survived the worst that false accusations can do finally told someone who'd never understand what that means exactly, where they could go, and did it with such controlled fury that even the host who'd started it seemed to realize she'd picked a fight with the wrong person. The View's studio hummed with its familiar late-morning energy, the audience settling in with that excited anticipation that comes from knowing they were about to see someone genuinely legendary. Sir Cliff Richard didn't do many American television appearances. His career had been predominantly British, despite his global record sales, and his agreeing to appear on The View was itself newsworthy. As the show's opening music faded, Whoopi Goldberg led the introduction with genuine warmth in her voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the one and only Sir Cliff Richard." The audience erupted in applause as Cliff walked out, his silver hair perfectly styled, his navy suit impeccable, waving with the practiced ease of someone who'd done this thousands of times over 6 decades. "Thank you so much for having me," Cliff said as he settled into the guest chair, his distinctive British accent immediately establishing him as different from their usual roster. "It's wonderful to be here in New York." Whoopi beamed at him with obvious respect. "We're thrilled to have you, Sir Cliff. Your memoir, The Dreamer, has been climbing the bestseller lists on both sides of the Atlantic. Tell us what inspired you to finally tell your story after all these years." Cliff leaned forward slightly, his entire demeanor lighting up when given the chance to discuss his work. "Well, Whoopi, after 6 decades in this business, I realized I had stories that needed telling. Not just about the music, though, there's plenty of that, but about the journey, the friendships, the challenges we all face in life, and most importantly, the faith that sustains us through everything." Sarah Haynes nodded approvingly, clearly engaged with the conversation. "The book is incredibly honest about your faith journey and how it anchored you through some very difficult times. That must have been vulnerable to share." "It was," Cliff admitted, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "But I believe authenticity resonates with people. My faith has been my anchor through everything, the extraordinary highs and the devastating lows. Without it, I honestly don't know how I would have survived some of the storms I've weathered." The reference to storms was subtle, but everyone in the room knew what he was alluding to: the investigation that had dominated the final years before his exoneration, the trauma that had nearly broken him. But the other host seemed content to let him reference it on his own terms, respecting the boundary his publicist had established. Everyone except Joy Behar. She'd been unusually quiet up to this point, sitting back in her chair with that particular expression of someone waiting for their moment, building up to something. And now, as the conversation flowed naturally towards celebrating Cliff's resilience, Joy leaned forward with a sharp smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Speaking of storms, Cliff," she said, her voice cutting through the warm atmosphere like a blade, "you've certainly had your share of controversies over the years, haven't you?" The temperature in the studio seemed to drop several degrees. Cliff's smile remained fixed, but anyone watching closely would have noticed the subtle tightening around his eyes, the almost imperceptible shift in his posture from relaxed guest to man preparing to defend himself. "I'm not sure what you're referring to, Joy," he said carefully, his voice still pleasant but with a warning edge creeping in. Joy waved her hand dismissively, a gesture that conveyed she had no intention of being deterred by Cliff's careful response. "Oh, come on. The investigations, the allegations. Don't you think it's a bit convenient that you're promoting a book about redemption and faith right after all that mess?" Whoopi shot Joy a warning look that was impossible to miss clearly. This was not what they'd agreed to discuss. But Joy was just getting started, clearly energized by having cornered her prey. The other hosts shifted uncomfortably in their seats, as Cliff's demeanor began to change from warm guest to something harder, more guarded. "Joy," Cliff said, and his voice remained controlled, but with steel beginning to show through the British politeness. "I think you're conflating very different situations, and doing so deliberately. The matter you're alluding to was thoroughly investigated by the South Yorkshire Police for 2 years. 2 years of my life. And I was completely exonerated. Not sort of cleared or insufficient evidence, completely exonerated." Joy scoffed. Actually scoffed, and the sound echoed through the increasingly tense studio. Exonerated is a strong word. Just because charges weren't filed doesn't mean... "It means exactly that," Cliff interrupted, and the crack in his composure was beginning to show. "It means I was innocent of any wrongdoing, which I always was and always will be. The police found nothing because there was nothing to find." The studio audience had gone completely silent, sensing that what had started as a promotional interview was rapidly transforming into something much more serious, much more uncomfortable. This wasn't playful banter or challenging questions, this was an interrogation, and everyone could feel it. Joy wasn't backing down. In fact, she seemed to be warming up, clearly enjoying the confrontation she'd engineered. "But surely you understand why people might be skeptical. I mean, these types of allegations don't just come out of nowhere." Sonny Hostin tried desperately to intervene, clearly recognizing that Joy was crossing lines that shouldn't be crossed. "Joy, maybe we should focus on the book itself, the actual content." "No, no," Joy said sharply, cutting her off with a gesture that brooked no argument. "This is exactly what we should be talking about. Accountability, transparency. Not just feel-good stories about faith and redemption, when there are real questions that remain unanswered." Cliff's jaw tightened visibly, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. Accountability for what exactly? His voice was rising now, the careful control beginning to slip. "For being falsely accused? For having my reputation dragged through the mud by people who don't care about facts? For having my home raided on live television, yes, live television, while I was thousands of miles away, completely unaware?" "Oh, here we go," Joy said, rolling her eyes with theatrical disdain. "The victim narrative. It's always the same with you guys." "You guys?" Cliff repeated, and there was genuine shock in his voice now alongside the anger. "What exactly do you mean by that, Joy?" The tension was becoming unbearable. Whoopi was frantically trying to signal to the producers, her expression making clear that she wanted this segment ended immediately. Sarah looked like she wanted to disappear into her chair. But Joy Behar was in her element now, leaning back with the satisfied expression of someone who believed they'd successfully exposed hypocrisy. Privileged men who think they can just sweep their past under the rug with a nice book tour and some crocodile tears about faith, Joy said, her voice dripping with contempt. Men who use their celebrity status and their charitable work as a shield against accountability. That was the moment everything changed. Sir Cliff Richard, who had maintained his composure through 2 years of hell, who had endured every possible humiliation with dignity, who had survived the worst that false accusations could inflict, finally reached his breaking point. His face flushed red, and when he spoke, his voice carried a quiet fury that was somehow more intimidating than shouting would have been. "How dare you," he said, each word precisely enunciated with that distinctive British diction that made the anger all the more devastating. How dare you sit there in your comfortable chair and make accusations against a man you don't know about situations you clearly haven't bothered to research properly? Joy's eyes widened slightly at the venom in Cliff's voice, but she quickly recovered, clearly relishing the fight she'd started. "Oh, I've done my research, Sir Cliff, and what I found was a pattern of using your celebrity status and your charitable work as a shield." "A shield?" Cliff's voice was incredulous now, his 73 years of maintained composure completely shattered. "My charitable work spans 5 decades. I've raised millions upon millions for children's causes, for disaster relief, for countless organizations helping people who actually need it. Are you seriously suggesting that helping others is some kind of smokescreen? That dedicating my life to making the world better is suspicious?" "I'm suggesting," Joy said, leaning forward with predatory intensity, "that people in positions of power often use good deeds to cover up bad behavior. It's the oldest playbook in the book. We see it time and time again." Alyssa Farah Griffin finally found her voice, clearly horrified by where this was heading. "How dare you," he said, each word precisely enunciated with that distinctive British diction that made the anger all the more devastating. "How dare you sit there in your comfortable chair and make accusations against a man you don't know about situations you clearly haven't bothered to research properly?" Joy's eyes widened slightly at the venom in Cliff's voice, but she quickly recovered, clearly relishing the fight she'd started. "Oh, I've done my research, Sir Cliff." Cliff stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor with a harsh sound that echoed through the silent studio. The movement was so sudden, so decisive, that it seemed to freeze everyone in place. "I will not sit here," he said, his voice shaking with barely controlled rage, "and be lectured about accountability by someone who clearly has no interest in facts or fairness. None whatsoever." "Sit down, Sir Cliff," Joy said mockingly, emphasizing his title with obvious sarcasm, clearly trying to regain control through condescension. "You came on this show to sell your book, so let's talk about what's really in it. All this talk about redemption and forgiveness, but what about taking responsibility?" "Responsibility for what?" Cliff's voice was louder now, his British accent thickening with emotion in the way it always did when he was deeply affected. "For being the victim of a malicious, anonymous accusation that was thoroughly investigated and found to be completely baseless? For having my private home raided on live television in a coordinated spectacle between the police and the BBC? For having my name dragged through every tabloid in the country before any investigation even began?" Joy waved her hand dismissively, and the gesture seemed to break something fundamental in Cliff's remaining composure. "Oh, please. The persecution complex is strong with this one." "Persecution complex?" Cliff repeated, and his voice was shaking now. "Do you have any idea, any concept whatsoever what it's like to have your entire life's work questioned because of lies? To have people you've never met, people who know nothing about you, decide you're guilty based on gossip and innuendo? To watch your reputation burn while police take 2 years of your life, to prove what you already knew, which is that you did nothing wrong. Welcome to the real world." Joy shot back coldly. "Where actions have consequences and celebrity doesn't make you untouchable." "What actions?" Cliff exploded, his voice echoing through the studio with such force that even the camera operators flinched. "What consequences? I was investigated by the South Yorkshire Police for 2 years. 2 years of hell. They turned over every stone, interviewed every person I'd ever worked with, examined every aspect of my entire career, my entire life. And do you know what they found? Nothing. For being the victim of a malicious, anonymous accusation that was thoroughly investigated and found to be completely baseless? For having my private home raided on live television in a coordinated spectacle between the police and the BBC? For having my name dragged through every tabloid in the country before any investigation even began?" Joy waved her hand dismissively, and the gesture seemed to break something fundamental in Cliff's remaining composure. "Oh, please. Sometimes justice isn't served in a courtroom or through an investigation." "Justice?" Cliff's voice cracked with emotion now. tears beginning to well in his eyes despite his obvious efforts to maintain control. "You want to talk about justice? Where was the justice when my accuser was allowed to remain completely anonymous, while my name was splashed across every headline in the country? Where was the justice when the media convicted me before any investigation even began? Where was the justice when people like you decided I was guilty simply because I was accused?" Joy shrugged with calculated indifference, and the gesture was so dismissive, so contemptuous, that several people in the audience audibly gasped. "If you have nothing to hide, then why are you so defensive?" The question hung in the air like a poison cloud. It was the ultimate catch. 2-2. The kind of loaded question that made any response seem incriminating. Silence would look like guilt. Anger would look like guilt. Denial would look like guilt. It was designed to wound, not to illuminate. Cliff stared at Joy for a long moment, his chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, but carried something dangerous underneath. "Defensive?" he said softly. "You ambush me on live television with false accusations and character assassination based on events that were thoroughly investigated and completely resolved, and you call my response defensive?" "I call it suspicious," Joy replied with a smirk, clearly pleased with herself. "Innocent people don't usually react this way to simple questions." "Simple questions?" Cliff's voice was climbing again, control slipping further with each exchange. "You've spent the last 10 minutes implying that I'm a criminal who uses charity work to cover up misconduct. You've suggested that my faith is fake, that my book is a lie, that I somehow escaped justice through privilege and power. And you call that simple questions?" Sarah Haynes tried desperately to redirect, her voice almost pleading. "Maybe we could talk about your upcoming tour, about the new music." "No," Cliff said firmly, his eyes never leaving Joy's face. "We're going to finish this conversation because this is exactly what's wrong with modern media. People like her," he pointed directly at Joy, "think they can destroy someone's reputation based on nothing more than their own prejudices and assumptions. Based on a narrative they've decided is true regardless of what the facts actually show." Joy actually laughed. She actually laughed, and the sound was sharp and mocking and seemed to echo through the silent studio. "Oh, this is rich. Now I'm the villain because I asked some tough questions? This is why victims don't come forward, you know. Because powerful men like you turn everything around and make themselves the victims." "Victims?" Cliff's voice was barely controlled now, emotion threatening to overwhelm him completely. "You want to know about victims? I'll tell you about victims. Victims are the children I've spent my entire career trying to help through my charitable work. Real children, with real problems, who benefited from real help. Victims are the fans who've been confused and hurt by malicious lies spread about someone they admired. Victims are innocent people who have their lives completely destroyed by false accusations, while people like you cheer from the sidelines, deciding that smoke must mean fire regardless of what the investigation actually found." The studio was completely silent now except for Cliff's heavy breathing and the distant sound of cameras continuing to roll, capturing every moment of this catastrophic interview. Joy sat back in her chair with a satisfied smile playing on her lips, as if she'd accomplished exactly what she'd set out to do, provoke an emotional response that she could then use as evidence of guilt. "Are you finished with your little tantrum?" she asked coolly, and her tone was so dismissive, so contemptuous, that it seemed designed to provoke an even worse reaction. That was the final straw. Sir Cliff Richard, who had maintained his dignity through 6 decades of public life, who had weathered scandals and setbacks with grace, who had survived 2 years of absolute hell with his faith intact, finally reached the point of no return. His face went white with fury, and when he spoke, his voice was deadly quiet in a way that was somehow more intimidating than any amount of shouting. "Tantrum?" he whispered, and the studio had to strain to hear him. "You think this is a tantrum? This is what happens when a decent person, a person who spent 60 years trying to do good in the world, finally stands up to a bully who's decided that tearing others down makes for good television. Joy's confident smirk faltered slightly at the word bully, but she quickly tried to regain her composure. Bully? I'm a journalist asking legitimate questions about... Journalist? Cliff let out a bitter laugh that echoed through the studio. Is that what you call yourself? A journalist? Because real journalists deal in facts, not character assassination. Real journalists do actual research instead of relying on gossip and innuendo. Real journalists understand that when someone has been investigated exhaustively and cleared completely, continuing to suggest guilt isn't brave, it's cruel. I've done my research, Joy insisted, but there was a defensive edge creeping into her voice now. I know about the allegations, the investigation, the settlement. Settlement? Cliff's voice rose to a near shout, his composure shattering completely. What settlement? There was no settlement, because there was no case. His face went white with fury, and when he spoke, his voice was deadly quiet in a way that was somehow more intimidating than any amount of shouting. Tantrum? He whispered, and the studio had to strain to hear him. You think this is a tantrum? This is what happens when a decent person, a person who's spent 60 years trying to do good in the world, finally stands up to a bully who's decided that tearing others down makes for good television. You want to talk about justice? Where was the justice when my accuser was allowed to remain completely anonymous, while my name was splashed across every headline in the country? Where was the justice when the media convicted me before any investigation even began? Where was the justice when people like you decided I was guilty simply because I was accused? Joy shrugged with calculated indifference, and the gesture was so dismissive, so contemptuous. You're literally making things up on live television. You've confused me with someone else, or mixed up completely different situations, and you're sitting here destroying my reputation based on information you can't even get right. Joy's face flushed red as she realized her mistake, clearly having confused details from different cases or different people entirely. You've confused me with someone else, or mixed up completely different situations, and yet you're sitting here destroying my reputation based on information you can't even get right. This isn't journalism. This is a hit job. Whoopi finally found her voice, trying desperately to salvage something from this disaster. Cliff, I think there might be some confusion here. The production team was clearly in crisis mode now. Cameras were still rolling because they had to. This was live television, but there was frantic activity behind the scenes as producers tried to figure out how to handle what was rapidly becoming the most explosive moment in the views. Recent history. Sunny Hostin attempted to mediate, her voice carrying a note of desperation. I think we can all agree that emotions are running very high here. Maybe we should take a breath and... No, Cliff interrupted, his gaze still fixed on Joy with laser focus. I want her to answer my question. Do you believe the police investigation was thorough? Do you believe that if there had been any evidence at all of wrongdoing, charges would have been filed? Yes or no? Joy shifted uncomfortably in her seat, clearly realizing the trap, but unable to avoid it. I believe the system isn't always perfect. That's not what I asked, Cliff pressed, leaning forward. I asked if you believe the investigation was thorough. It's a simple question, yes or no. I don't know all the details of the investigation, Joy admitted reluctantly, and the admission seemed to cost her something. You don't know the details, Cliff repeated slowly, letting each word sink in. But you felt qualified to question the results on national television. You don't know the facts, but you were ready to destroy someone's reputation anyway. Do you see the problem here? Do you understand what you've done? Joy's face was now bright red, and her usual quick wit seemed to have abandoned her completely. I was trying to have a discussion about accountability in the entertainment industry. By using me as your example without bothering to learn the actual facts of my case? Cliff shot back. That's not a discussion, Joy. That's persecution. That's exactly what destroyed 2 years of my life. And you're doing it again right here, right now, for entertainment. The word persecution hung in the air like a bombshell. Several people in the studio audibly gasped at the rawness of Cliff's pain, the genuine trauma that was now visible in every line of his face. "That's a very strong word," Joy said weakly, perhaps beginning to realize just how badly this had gone wrong. "It's the right word," Cliff replied firmly, tears now openly streaming down his face despite his obvious efforts to maintain composure. "When you destroy someone's reputation based on lies and misinformation, when you refuse to accept the results of a thorough investigation because they don't match the narrative you prefer, when you use someone's pain as entertainment, what else would you call it?" He stood up then, his hands shaking as he reached for his microphone. "I came here today to talk about my book, my music, my upcoming tour. I came here in good faith, expecting to have a civilized conversation with professional broadcasters. Instead, I was ambushed by someone who confused me with other people, made up facts that don't exist, and tried to destroy my reputation all over again for her own entertainment." Joy opened her mouth to respond, but Cliff held up his hand to stop her, his voice breaking with emotion. "I'm not finished. For 2 years of my life, I lived under a cloud of suspicion for something I didn't do. For 2 years, I watched my reputation get torn apart by people who didn't care about the truth. And just when I thought I could move forward with my life, people like you drag it all back up again. Not because you have new information, not because you care about justice, but because you think it makes for good television." The studio was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Even the usually restless audience was completely still, mesmerized by the raw emotion and genuine pain in Cliff's voice. "Well, congratulations," Cliff continued, his voice thick with tears and anger. "You got your dramatic television moment. You got to watch a man defend himself against false accusations on live television. I hope you're satisfied. I hope the ratings are worth it." With that, Sir Cliff Richard removed his microphone, with shaking hands, and placed it carefully on the table in front of him. He looked directly into the camera, his eyes still bright with unshed tears but his voice steady and clear with purpose. "To anyone watching this who has ever been falsely accused of anything, who has ever had their reputation destroyed by lies, who has ever felt helpless against the court of public opinion, I want you to know that you're not alone. Sometimes standing up for yourself means walking away from people who have no interest in the truth. Sometimes dignity means refusing to participate in your own destruction." He turned to look at the other hosts, his expression softening slightly as he acknowledged their discomfort with what had happened. "Whoopi, Sarah, Sunny, Alyssa, thank you for trying to maintain some dignity in this situation. You're professionals, and it shows. You tried to stop this, and I appreciate that." Then he looked directly at Joy Behar, who was staring at him with a mixture of shock and something that might have been shame, might have been recognition of having gone too far. "And Joy," he said quietly, his voice still breaking but firm with conviction, "I hope someday you learn the difference between holding people accountable and tearing them down for sport. There's a real difference, and it matters. It matters to the people whose lives you damage. It matters to the truth, and it should matter to you." Without another word, Sir Cliff Richard walked off the view set with as much dignity as he could muster, leaving behind one of the most shocking confrontations in daytime television history. The camera lingered on Joy's face for a moment, capturing her stunned expression, before Whoopi finally managed to call for a commercial break, her own face showing a mixture of sympathy for Cliff and frustration with her colleague. The aftermath was immediate and brutal. Within minutes, clips of the confrontation were spreading across social media with hashtags like #StandWithCliff and #Joy Behar crossed the line trending worldwide. News outlets picked up the story immediately, with most commentary supporting Cliff's walkout and criticizing Joy's approach as cruel and unprofessional. In that moment, as Sir Cliff Richard walked away with whatever dignity he could salvage from the wreckage of what should have been a pleasant interview, it was clear who had won this battle. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to participate in your own destruction. And sometimes standing up for yourself means walking away from people who've decided that your pain is their entertainment, your trauma is their content, and your innocence proven through exhaustive investigation somehow isn't enough to satisfy their need for scandal.